Today's lesson should be fairly brief. Before we can begin multiplying and dividing integers, which is what we're going to do tomorrow, we need to discuss the variety of ways multiplication and division can be written. So let's start with multiplication. You're probably very familiar with seeing multiplication written this way. And you may have learned last year that we can use what's called a multiplication dot in the center instead of the times sign. And here's what I'm going to refer to as the high school way. Many times, because we're going to start using variables, we don't want to use that times sign because it looks like the variable or the letter X. And this dot sometimes can get lost or kind of looks like a decimal. So the high school way is to write numbers side by side. Side by side means multiply. So we're going to see this way fairly frequently. So this next series of numbers says 8 times 7. We could also write it as 8 times 7. What would it look like if we wanted to write that the high school way? So we would write two numbers side by side, 8 times 7, and the 7 must be enclosed in parentheses. Otherwise, as you may have looked at the answer choice, it looks like 87. So we have to distinguish between 87 and 8 times 7 using the set of parentheses. Also, sometimes they use variables. So they might, for instance, write 5 times A. So the old-fashioned way is 5 times A. Now we move away from that because this times sign kind of looks like a variable. If I were going to use the dot, it would be 5 times A. But the high school way, because I have a number 5 and an alphabet letter or a variable A, I don't really have to use the parentheses. We could write it this way, but we rarely do. When it's a number and a variable, we don't have to use the parentheses. The reason we had to use the parentheses for the last example is if I didn't, it would look like 87. So the parentheses must be there when numbers are next to each other. So sometimes we multiply two variables. For instance, we might say A times B. So A times B. You can already see how confusing that might look. We could use the dot, that makes it a little bit better, but how do you think we'd write it if we wanted to write it the high school way? If you said AB, you're correct. Because they're both variables, both letters, we don't need parentheses. We can just write them next to each other. So side by side means multiply. Now let's move on to division. If you look at this problem, we're used to seeing this traditional division sign. So this is read as 20 divided by 5. But our new high school way to write division looks like a fraction bar. In fact, this fraction bar right here also means division. So when we put this little bar between numbers or variables, it means we're dividing. It means exactly the same thing as this. The top number and the first number are the same. The bottom number are the second number behind the division sign. So I cannot write this as 5 divided by 20. That would be wrong. That doesn't mean the same thing. 5 divided by 20. It's read as 20 divided by 5. So looking at the next example, 54 divided by 6, how do you think you could write that using our new way that looks like a fraction? And just like multiplication, sometimes we're given variables. For instance, I could have x, some unknown number, divided by 10. Should I write this as 10 over x, or should I write it as x over 10? So the first way or the second way? If you said the second way, you are correct. The first number is always the top number, and vice versa. If I were given it written like this, I'd know I could also write it, the top number comes first, then the division bar, then the bottom number. So this fraction bar and this division bar mean the same thing. Thanks for completing this lesson, and tomorrow we're going to dive into multiplying and dividing positive and negative integers. Have a good day.